Chapter 4, Agency Relationships, Duties, and Disclosures. This one is going to be a very important chapter. To begin with, the concept of agency. All this is a relationship that licensees have with both buyers, sellers, landlords, tenants. It has to do with how we deal with people and how we treat people. From the very beginning, agency laws were not around. The only relationships we had, we entered into a listing contract. I would promise to sell a seller's house and they would promise to pay me a commission. It wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that we became involved with agency and the development agency relationships. One of the very first things we did was we identified a single agent relationship, we created a dual agent relationship, and we created a transaction brokerage relationship. Well, we learned early that the dual agent relationship didn't work. It's very difficult to represent a buyer's best interest and a seller's best interest at the same time. So that was repealed. And so currently the laws that we have are a bit different. Let me make a comment about the difference between a special agent and a general agent. A special agent is somebody like a real estate sales associate, where we have a single task to do, listing a property. A general agent could be somebody like a property manager that not only does leases, they do maintenance, they do all kinds of other tasks as part of their job. One of the things that we need to understand in this whole process is what is a fiduciary duty. Now, in some cases, real estate agents and licensees have a fiduciary relationship with buyers and sellers, and sometimes they don't. The fiduciary is simply a relationship of loyalty, really more than anything else. Let's talk about disclosures. Florida is requiring all licensees to make certain disclosures at certain times in certain relationships. To begin with, the disclosures that we have to do today are informational only in most cases, and they have to be made in residential transactions only. In other words, these don't apply to non-residential or commercial type transactions. And let me see if I can define what a residential transaction is. It's kind of easy. It's up to 4 units, like a fourplex, and it's any vacant land of 10 acres or less. I think that's a good way to kind of remember what a residential transaction is. Now, what are the various authorized relationships that we have? They come into 3 categories. One is the no brokerage relationship. The no brokerage relationship requires us to deal openly, honestly, and fairly with individuals that we're dealing with. We have to disclose material defects, and we have to put money in escrow in a timely manner. In addition, we have to make a disclosure of that relationship prior to showing property. Now, one of the things that this does not have that the other relationship has is something called skill, care, and diligence. Another type of relationship, and probably the one that has the most authority, the most obligation, is going to be the single agent relationship. The single agent relationship is the one with the fiduciary duties. And to explain this, it's easy. We are representing our client's best interest over everybody else, including ourselves. So therefore, one of the biggest components of a single agent relationship is going to be loyalty. We are loyal to them. We're adversarial to them. We're working to get the very best we can for them. And it also contains skill, care, and diligence, which means that we have to operate in a manner that we're doing the very best we can for them. The final type of agency that we have is something called transaction brokerage. Now, the way that Florida statute is set up, and the way that we operate currently, is that we are presumed in the state of Florida to be operating as a transaction broker. And that is that we have limited authority. We have limited confidentiality. We do not have loyalty. We do not have a fiduciary. A good way to remember the difference between the two: as a single agent, I'm representing somebody's best interest. I work for them. In a transaction brokerage, I'm not representing their best interest necessarily, but I can't do anything that's going to be harmful to them either. I'm more working with them as a facilitator than I am anything else. As far as my disclosures for transaction brokerage, there are no disclosures if I'm operating in a transaction brokerage relationship. Now, as far as a single agent, I have to disclose that I'm a single agent either prior to showing property or prior to entering in some kind of a contract with that person. Now, the one thing about working as a transaction broker and a single agent, sometimes brokers want to operate as a single agent on the front side, representing maybe a seller's best interest. But anytime that they have to show properties in-house, that's going to create a problem, because here's the problem. A sales associate, when they take a listing, that listing does not belong to them. It belongs to the broker or the brokerage company that they represent. So if a broker, a brokerage, is representing a seller as a single agent, they cannot operate and represent the buyer as a single agent. So how do we do that? So if we're showing properties in-house, that creates a dilemma. So what a lot of brokers do is they say, I'm going to represent my sellers as a single agent, but if I have to show properties in-house, I'm going to transition both of these to a transaction brokerage where I can work with both of them, but not in a fiduciary relationship, where I'm a facilitator for both. And honestly, as a facilitator, as a transaction broker, your job is to bring the buyer and the seller together to find common ground. That's who a transaction broker is. The single agent does not have that responsibility. The single agent, remember, is working for either the buyer or the seller's best interest. Their concern is not with that other party. If you're a transaction broker, you can never do or say anything that's going to be harmful or lead harm one over the other. In other words, everybody has to be on the same level playing field. You can't tilt, is what I'm trying to tell you. If you're going to transition, we have a form that has to be signed. It is a consent to transition from single agent to transaction brokerage. Out of all of the disclosures that we have, they're all informational only, except this consent to transition. This consent form must be signed by your client in order for you to be able to make that transition. And I think what the state of Florida is basically saying is, they want to make sure that your client understands that you're moving from a fiduciary representing their best interest, working for them, into a position where you're a facilitator and you're not representing their best interest, you're simply working with them. They have to understand that. Now, a designated sales associate can only occur in a non-residential transaction. And what I'm talking about is a commercial transaction. But it can only occur where you have two separate agents working for one broker in the same transaction, where the buyer and the seller both have assets of at least $1 million or more. At that point, the agents can become a designated sales associate and work more in a fiduciary relationship than in a transaction brokerage relationship. As far as terminating your agency and terminating relationships, obviously performance is going to be a great way to do this. But let me say this about bankruptcy. If you have a listing and your client files bankruptcy, I can tell you now that listing contract more than likely is going to become null and void. You'll need to contact the bankruptcy trustee or the bankruptcy courts if you intend to continue working for that particular property, because your client no longer has control over that property once bankruptcy has been filed. And that's all I'm going to have on Chapter 4 as far as agency relationships are concerned. So I'm going to move now on into my review. Now for our Chapter 4 review on agency relationships, duties, and disclosures. First of all, dual agency was repealed. A single agent relationship has full fiduciary. You can work with either the buyer or the seller, but you cannot represent both at the same time. And there's a disclosure that's going to be required. You have to disclose your relationship either prior to showing or prior to entering into a contract. In a transaction brokerage relationship, you have limited obligations. You can work with both the buyer and the seller at the same time, but you can't take sides. With this relationship, there are no disclosures required. In a no brokerage relationship, you offer skill, care, and diligence. It has minimum obligations, and the disclosure is prior to showing property. If you decide to transition from a single agent relationship to a transaction brokerage, you can do that, but that transitioning form has to be signed by your client. And that's all I've got for Chapter 4 review.